Chapter 36 All Things GED. It had been a long time coming, so Gary and Tony arrived early at the testing center and took their tests that Friday morning. By lunchtime, they learned that they had both passed and had finally earned their GED diplomas. Having been told by Carl the day before that he needed them to return to the store as soon as they could, when they arrived, they found a celebration in their honor had been prepared in the office. Gary was greeted by his mother, who hugged him and praised him for his accomplishment. He was glad to see her there, knowing how busy she had been since she'd arrived in Jacksonville. Also there were Denise and Carol. Everyone congratulated the boys, and then Carl called the room to attention. "You boys have come a long way from when you first came through these doors. Thelma and I have watched you both grow into responsible young men, and we are proud to tell you that, instead of promoting you to the stock clerk positions that we offered you, starting right now, you are both promoted to assistant manager trainees." The entire room erupted in cheers. Gary and Tony looked at one another, surprised, and then high-fived each other. "That's what I'm talking about," Tony shouted. "That means," Carl continued, talking over the noise in the room, "starting tomorrow, you're both responsible for opening up the store in the morning. Now, Thelma or myself will still be here every morning to train you, to take deliveries, and to do paperwork, and answer any questions you might have. If you think you can handle it, that is." Again, Gary and Tony looked at one another. "Yes, sir, we can handle that," they responded. Then they high-fived one another again. "But what would have happened if we didn't pass, boss?" Tony jokingly asked. "This would have been a going-away party, at least for one of you," Carl answered without missing a beat. Everybody started laughing. When the laughter died down, Carl added, "Well, look here. Y'all take the rest of the day off, and we'll see you first thing in the morning." "Yes, sir," Gary and Tony responded. Then Deborah, Denise, and Carol embraced the two, telling them both how proud they were of them. "Y'all go celebrate your day now. Thelma and I got work to do around here." This time, Gary and Tony both stopped and looked at each other, and then Tony said, "If it's all the same to you, boss, we'd rather work the rest of the day. We already had the morning off." "Yeah, we gotta get caught up, 'cause we all know these groceries ain't gonna sell themselves," Gary added. Everybody started laughing again. Soon they began filing out of the office. Denise took hold of Gary's hand and stopped him from leaving. She turned into him, hugging him, and then she kissed him in front of everyone. "I am so proud of you, Gary, and thank you for taking care of my Aunt Thelma and Uncle Carl." "Aww," Deborah, Carol, and Thelma said in unison. "I told you them's good boys. I told y'all," Carl said, walking out of the door ahead of everyone. On their way back to the Bradley firm, Deborah called Travis, hoping to tell him about Gary's promotion, but the call went to voicemail, so she could only leave a message telling him what happened. They returned from their long lunch break back to the Bradley firm to continue Carol's training, and Denise returned to campus in time for her next class. Chapter 37 Setting Things Straight. The week for Denise had been a busy one that had her preparing for the upcoming midterm exams and meeting with the school counselors that needed to sign off on the changes she'd made to her syllabus so that she could now pursue a degree in psychology. By now, the word had gotten around campus about Denise being a member of the Robinson family. All of the faculty were noticeably kinder to Denise, though she never knew whether it was because of her performance in class and her GPA, or her great-aunt and uncle being on the school board of directors. Either way, she thought, was fine with me. The more she was forced to deal with the attitudes from the other students, the more she came to feel grateful for the way that she was raised. She realized that it was because of the way that her mother treated her that forced her to become so much more mature than the other students her age. It was this maturity that prevented her from being affected by the attitudes of those students who judged her to be some spoiled little brat whose family gave her a step up in the world that they had to struggle in. Little did any of them know what she had really been through. Before the weekend arrived, Denise informed Mo that she was going to be away from school until Sunday, because it was school policy for all freshmen living on campus to report when they would be spending the night off campus. She was expecting that she would be spending the weekend with Gary at his apartment celebrating his passing the GED exam. She normally did it in writing, like everyone else, because none of the freshmen in the building had any desire to see Mo, but as she went up to drop off the note, she found Mo in the office. After telling her about her plans, Mo's response was nothing less than she expected. "So, what do you want me to do about it?" Denise's plan changed after Gary's promotion, because now he was going to be busy working at the store. They spent some time together until late Friday night, then she returned to her dorm. She found the RA office dark and empty when she got back, so she took the elevator up to her room. The next morning, after coming back from breakfast at the cafeteria, she was waiting for the elevator when Mo came up from behind and whispered into her ear, "I thought you were going away this weekend." Startled, Denise turned around. Mo was standing directly behind her, way too close, and with a sneer on her face. "What happened? Somebody forget to send the limo?" Mo taunted. Mo thought of herself as a tough girl. She grew up a tomboy, and when she arrived on campus, she carefully nurtured a reputation as someone you didn't want to mess with or get on the bad side of. She came from a poor family and always had a chip on her shoulder because of it. She was forced to work as an RA as part of her financial aid work-study assignment. Now that she was a senior and due to graduate at the end of the school year, she always maintained an air of superiority about her whenever it came to dealing with the freshmen on campus, and especially when she had to deal with the freshman students in the dorms that she was responsible for. She was even a bully at times when she thought she could get away with it. And this was one of those times. She had heard the rumors about Denise and mistakenly assumed, like so many others, that she was just a little rich girl born with a silver spoon in her mouth. As Denise recovered from her momentary surprise, seeing the sneer on Mo's face caused a different feeling to arise inside of her. It came across in her eyes as she stood face to face and eye to eye with Mo, who'd made the mistake of not stepping back when Denise turned around, choosing instead, like a bully, to remain in Denise's personal space. Denise's eyes ripped right past her cocky attitude and useless defenses. Mo could see and feel the razor slicing into her from Denise's gaze and immediately realized, albeit too late, that she had misjudged the younger girl. Now she tried to step back, but Denise advanced, staying eye to eye with her. Then, without looking away, Denise reached into her purse. Mo's eyes widened, and her face registered shock and fear, thinking the worst was about to come. Then Denise produced a notepad with a pen. Embarrassed now, knowing that the younger freshman saw the look of fear in her face, she took another step, backing away from Denise, who was writing a phone number on a piece of paper. Denise looked back up again, staring her in the eyes, and thrust the paper at Mo, who flinched, thinking Denise was swinging at her, then took the paper to cover up from flinching earlier. "No, I didn't call for the limo. I decided to change my plans. But here's the number. Just mention my name when you call, and they will take you wherever you want to go. Any time of the day," Denise said. Denise turned, hearing the elevator door opening. Without looking back, she got on the elevator, then turned and saw Mo still standing there, looking back at her, hand outstretched, still holding the paper with the number on it. Denise knew the number was fake, and hoped that Mo really would call it and find out that she'd been had. She continued staring Mo in the eye in silence as the elevator door closed. Just before it completely severed their view of one another, Denise saw her look down and away, her shoulders slumping as she finally relaxed. Denise smiled. Mo looked back up, still facing the elevator as the door closed. Then in frustration, she crushed the paper that she held in her hand. Turning around, she walked across the lobby to the sanctuary of her RA office. Chapter 38. The New Students. Gary and Tony had been opening and closing the St. John's grocery store for 2 weeks, training each day to be able to take over the daily tasks involved in running the store. Now, with their training complete, Carl and Thelma made their promotion official. Gary understood that he would have to remain as an acting store manager for another 3 months until his 18th birthday. But he and Tony were still looking forward to celebrating their promotion becoming official over the weekend. Gary invited Denise, unaware that she had a different kind of celebration for them in mind. Gary and Tony had planned on having fun, and maybe even having a little something to drink, because it was a special occasion. When Denise arrived at their apartment, things changed. She started telling them that now was the best time to begin the process of enrolling in college, because they were lucky enough to be able to schedule taking their SAT college entrance exam in only another 2 weeks. Otherwise, they would be waiting another 6 months before the next testing period would be held. They didn't hesitate to put aside their plans for partying. Neither of them were the type who partied anyway, so it was no big deal. Thanks to their earlier talk with Denise, they were already expecting to enroll in college after they finished training at the store, just not so soon afterward. Tony was intimidated by the idea of going to college and the idea of taking the SAT, but Denise was able to reassure him after explaining what the SAT was and that he and Gary had a big advantage over the others taking the test because the questions on the SAT exam were almost the same as the questions on the GED test, which they had both just recently passed. With Tony's confidence restored, she felt that now was the best time to show them what they really needed to do to actually start the process of enrolling into college. She had them sit on the couch in the living room, then she opened her knapsack and produced 2 big envelopes containing the applications that they had to fill out to get into college. She handed one each to Gary and Tony. "What is this, a book?" Tony jokingly asked, taking the thick envelope from Denise. "No, it's your application, silly," she responded. Before they opened the envelopes, Gary and Tony hesitated, looking at one another as if they were about to jump off a cliff. "Don't worry. It's not as bad as it looks. Trust me, it's going to be fun," Denise said cheerfully. Gary and Tony opened the packets and began looking over the papers. They could see that enrolling in college was much more complicated than filling out an application for a job. While going through the papers, Tony held up a stack. "Seems like you gotta have a college degree just to fill out the application to get into college," he said. Then all 3 of them started laughing. Denise reached back into her knapsack and brought out everything that they were going to need to fill out the application. First, she held up a box of pencils. She explained how in certain sections of the application they had to use the proper pencil lead, showing them the number on the pencil. "So that's what that's for. I always wondered what the number was all about," Tony said, and Gary shook his head in agreement. "See, you're already starting to learn new things," Denise said, trying to keep them motivated. She was doing her best to keep the mood cheerful, knowing firsthand how truly daunting the task ahead of them was. Then she showed them a box of pens, explaining how they were supposed to use the proper color ink. "You mean they actually want it in a certain color of ink?" Gary asked, surprised. "They sure do, Boo. In college, they teach you to pay attention to the little details. They want you to see things that are not obvious so that by the time you graduate, you will be the person who is able to come up with new ways of doing things, instead of just doing what somebody tells you to do." Both Gary and Tony really liked the way that sounded. "So that's what they be talking about when they say you gotta pay the cost to be the boss." "That's exactly what that means, Tony. See? You're gonna fit right in at college. You're a natural." Tony immediately felt proud and encouraged, erasing the little bit of lingering doubt that remained in the back of his mind about his ability to make it at college. "Oh, we definitely got this, my brother," Gary said. Gary put one arm around his friend's back and held his other hand in front of Tony, palm facing up. "Well, let's get it then," Tony replied, getting into the spirit and giving Gary 5 on his outstretched hand. Over the next few hours, Gary and Tony became engrossed in answering the questions on their applications. It didn't take them long to realize that filling out the college application was nothing like taking a test, finding that the questions were about their lives, which they both enjoyed answering. They started to relax, recognizing that Denise was right. It was fun. They worked together, going over each other's answers to the questions as a team, giving them a chance to share with one another the episodes in their life that produced the answer to the question that they were on. At one point, Tony pointed out how some of the questions could only be answered by someone who had actually been in a classroom environment. What about those kids who are homeschooled?" he asked, curious. "That's why a lot of them don't get into college," Denise said quickly. Unlike Tony, Denise had a much more jaded outlook of those who were homeschooled. Her biased opinion of them, though, started out as envy that later turned into the anger from a young girl who was forced early in life to accept that because of her situation at home, homeschooling for her was an impossibility. Now they came to the part of the application that wanted them to list their extracurricular activities while at school. For Gary, this was easy, having made it all the way to the national level, participating in the script spelling bee many years in a row. Denise recommended that he call his mother to see if he could have the certificates that she had seen hanging at home alongside the trophies that he'd won in competition. But for Tony, this section proved to be more difficult to answer. Trying to come up with something to put down in this section of the application, he began recalling his past and the situation at home when he was still in school. He was still thinking about his past when Denise suggested that they take a break before getting into the next section of the application because it called for them to write an essay to let the school know about their lives, what they expected to learn, and why they chose the school. It was almost lunchtime, so they all agreed and decided to order a pizza. As they took their break, Denise took the time to call her mother and found out that her training for paralegal was due to end at the end of next week, and Carol hoped she could be there to celebrate. Gary called Deborah and asked if there were any way he could get copies of the awards and certificates he'd won from the spelling bees. Deborah had already been thinking about telling Gary about Paul before he called, and was distracted from wondering why Gary wanted the certificates. She said that she would have Travis send them to him from Philly. She then explained to him about the improvements in her relationship with Travis's father, Paul. "You don't know much about him yet, but he was at the wedding. He's your grandfather, you know." Gary was surprised and happy because he had never been able to call anyone his grandfather before. After they hung up, he shared the news with Denise and Tony. As Tony listened to both Gary and Denise share their news about their family, he began thinking more deeply about his own. Chapter 39. Tony. Tony and his twin brothers, Albert and Alvin, were raised by their mother, Marta. She was a Cuban immigrant who'd arrived in the U.S. when she was 15 and married their father, Robert Taylor, when she turned 18 years old. He was older, a 28-year-old African-American man already deeply involved in the Jacksonville drug trade. He made a lot of money and, for 5 years, managed to keep his wife and twin boys living in an upscale home in an upscale neighborhood. When Marta was 6 months pregnant with Tony, Robert was arrested on charges of drugs and murder, and just before Tony was born, was sentenced to prison without the hope of ever getting out. Afterwards, Marta and her sons had to move, and the twins began to experience what it meant to grow up poor, having to now live in low-income housing projects. They were only 6 years old, still too young to understand what going to jail meant, and only resented their father for leaving them. All of Marta's sons were not only protected by her, but also by their father's well-known reputation while growing up in their poverty-stricken neighborhood. Marta refused to let her sons follow in their father's footsteps, and none of her sons were ever drawn into the street life of their inner-city neighborhood. Through it all, Tony's brothers, who were sheltered and privileged in their formative years before Tony was born, and being twins, always seemed to have a bond that never included him. They always had been the apples in their mother's eyes for as far back as Tony could remember, leaving him feeling isolated and like the black sheep in the family. Tony was a people person. At an early age, he became skilled at staying positive, not letting situations like his mother's blatant favoritism for his brothers get him down. He was immediately liked by everyone that he met, because he wasn't the type of person to hold a grudge against anyone. He believed that, like him, people only did what they thought was best, without intending to hurt anyone in the process, and that included his mother. He was outgoing and enjoyed socializing at school before returning home to the shroud of loneliness that he endured when around his family. He was entering the 6th grade when his brothers were graduating from high school. They immediately enrolled in college, then moved away to attend school in California, leaving Tony alone with his mother. Over the next 5 years for Tony, life at home remained an uneventful period of solitude. His mother became even more distant, but he was unaffected. He'd expected it. He continued to stay out of trouble throughout his teenage years, but struggled keeping up with schoolwork after he entered high school. He had to attend summer school every year just to be able to pass to the next grade. It was only after he entered the 11th grade that his mother began to show any interest in his life. She began to urge him to grow up, repeatedly telling him that he had to find a job. She told him to find a job doing something that he enjoyed doing so that it wouldn't seem like work, and once he figured out what that was, to do it for the rest of his life, if he wanted to be happy. Tony took to heart what she said, but accepted the first job that hired him and started working fast food. He was happy to be out of the house, no longer pressured by his mother every day to find a job, and he enjoyed the people that he worked with. For Tony, at 17 years old, that was enough. He enjoyed going to work and was still working there a year later when his mother again began pressuring him, only now it was to find a better job. She told him to find something that he could call a career, but this only led him to finding new reasons to stay away from home. One day after he got off from work, Tony went with some of his co-workers to a house party on the other side of town. He was meeting new people and enjoying himself when suddenly the police arrived to shut the party down. Everyone at the party began scattering, and so did he. He hadn't done anything wrong, not even joining his friends who were underage but drinking beer. It was just because everyone else was running. Tony took off in the direction away from the police and kept running until he could no longer see their cars. He tried looking for his friends that brought him to the party, but couldn't find them. He had never been in that part of the city before, so he started walking back to the area where the party took place. As he neared the house, he was surrounded by several police vehicles. He immediately put his hands up and was arrested. He was taken to the jail and booked, not even knowing what the charge against him was. He spent the night in jail, and the next morning was taken to court. He was surprised to find that not only was his mother in the courtroom, but that he had been charged with possession of narcotics. When his case was called, Tony passionately explained what happened at the party and denied ever having any drugs on him or having ever done drugs before. He even offered to take a drug test to prove his innocence. The judge, however, refused his offer, saying that just because he didn't do drugs doesn't prove that he didn't have drugs on him when he was arrested. The two officers who arrested him glanced at one another and smiled, relieved. The judge did say in his defense that because it was his first offense and a minor drug arrest, possession of less than 1 ounce of marijuana, he was given a sentence of time served and 6 months probation with no fine. The judge then told him that as long as he was not involved in any other infractions, his record would be expunged at the completion of his probation. Then the judge had Marta come up and stand beside her son. He explained to her that this was the lightest possible sentence he could impose on her son, and that he would be released immediately to her custody. Tony was relieved and happy with the judge's ruling, but his mother only saw it as him following in his father's footsteps. She didn't say anything to him as they left the courthouse, or as they rode the city bus back home. After they arrived home, she stopped him from entering the apartment. She went inside and then immediately returned with all of his clothes in plastic bags. She put them down on the front porch and told him he was no longer welcome in her home. Then she went back inside and closed the front door, locking it. Tony just stood there in shock on the front porch. He knocked on the door for hours until he finally accepted that she wasn't going to let him back in. His first thought was to contact his co-workers, hoping to be able to stay with one of them. He walked down to the store and called his job. The manager informed him that he had been fired for not showing up to work or calling to let them know he wouldn't be coming in. When he explained that he had gotten arrested and spent the night in jail, so he couldn't call, the manager said it didn't change the facts and that they had already hired someone else for his position. The manager then told him he had to get back to work and that Tony could come in and pick up his check at the end of the week. Tony just stood there in shock as the problems in his life began closing in on him. After some time, he contacted his brothers, hoping that they could help. But like their mother, as soon as they heard that he was arrested for drugs, they wanted nothing to do with him. Unemployed, and with no place else to go, he made his way to the homeless shelter and never returned to school to finish his senior year. He was still living at the homeless shelter when he met Gary. After listening to Denise and Gary talking about their parents, Tony began thinking about reaching out to his mother. It was something he had not once considered doing since she put him out 4 years ago. He knew that to reconnect with her meant having to go back to the apartment that he grew up in, because if his mother still had a phone, he could not remember what the number was. During their break from filling out the applications, Tony made the sudden decision to go and visit his mother. He told Gary and Denise only that he was going to go out and he would be back later on. They were confused and asked him if something was wrong. No, everything is fine. I just have something I have to do, he said. He neglected to tell them where he was going, knowing how excited they would be, and then how disappointed they would be if things turned out like he thought they would. Tony didn't have any illusions that his homecoming would be a celebrated event by his mother. He only felt the sudden desire to try. "Well, don't be too long, bro. We still have a pizza on the way," Gary said, sounding worried. "I won't be long, don't worry. It's just something I forgot to do," Tony answered, trying to reassure his friend. He left the apartment and took the bus to his old neighborhood. The trip on the bus gave him more time to reflect on his childhood and how he was treated by his mother. As he walked down the street to his old home, he looked around, noticing that in 4 years, nothing seemed to have changed. He walked up the walkway to the duplex where he'd lived his entire life and knocked on the screen door. He waited for a full minute before he opened it and then knocked harder on the front door. He heard his mother's thick Cuban accent immediately answer from behind the closed door. "Who is it?" a shrill voice shouted. "It's Tony, Mama." "What you want here? I don't have drug for you. Go back where you come from. Nothing for you here. Go away or I call the police." Tony stood where he was, still hoping that she would open the door. Finally, after waiting long enough, he said to the closed door, "I love you, Mama." "Go away, damn you. I call the police right now." Then he turned around and began walking towards the bus stop. As he walked away, he began thinking about Gary and Denise and Carl and Thelma, realizing how lucky he was to have met them, because if he had still been living here with his mother, nothing in his life would have changed. Just like this neighborhood and the people who live here, he thought as he walked to the bus stop. When he came through the door at the apartment, he found Gary and Denise in the living room, still working on the application. "Hey, bro!" Gary exclaimed, happy and surprised to see him. Gary had called him bro 100 times before, but right now it meant so much to him. Tony went up to Gary and hugged him tightly. Then he reached out to Denise and pulled her into the embrace. "Y'all are my family, you know that?" he whispered in the embrace, suddenly breathing heavily, his voice trembling. Gary and Denise, having both lived through a similar experience with their parents, immediately understood what had happened, and they held him tightly. "We're all we got, and that's a lot more than most," Gary said. The three remained holding each other quietly. Then, after a few moments, Tony broke the embrace and wiped the tears running down his cheeks. He cleared his throat. "Who's up for a pizza?" Both Gary and Denise started laughing. Denise took Tony's hand and walked him into the dining room. On the table sat a pizza. "We didn't eat any of it yet. We were waiting for you," she said. Gary came up and put his arm around Tony's shoulder. "Come on, bro, let's eat." While they were eating, Tony told them why he left. Gary and Denise hugged Tony until he believed them when they told him that we are family and nobody was ever going to break us up. "As long as I have y'all, I got all I need," Tony finally admitted. "The Three Musketeers!" Denise shouted. Then they all high-fived each other in agreement. Chapter 40. The Art of the Deal. Deborah and Carol slept most of the day Saturday, and when they awoke, the effects of having worked day and night throughout the week caught up to them, and they went to bed early Saturday night. After she woke up, Deborah waited until 11 to call James. Because of his fondness for Sunday brunch, she knew that he would be awake. She told him that they had finally finished the paperwork on the Robinson family businesses. He mentioned seeing her text, and his first question was about the final total. When she told him, he fell silent. She waited and said nothing during the silence. "That much? Does he know?" James asked. "No, not yet. We haven't told him, but I'm sure he has some idea. Remember, he'd been trying to get this account long before Travis and I got married." "Ah, that's right. I forgot about that," James said. "I think he pulled a fast one on us, though, James," Deborah finally said aloud. "What do you mean?" he asked. Deborah started at the beginning, back when she thought that he'd agreed too quickly to pay DC Consulting, when both she and Carol first felt something wasn't right about him. She told him about how quickly Albert produced the contract, and then she remembered his odd reaction at the airport when she'd mentioned how generous she thought the firm was providing for her. Feeling exasperated, she said that she knew what she was saying might sound paranoid, but even if she couldn't find the right words to explain it, she had strong feelings of distrust for him, and there were so many times she felt that way after talking to him, there had to be something to it. "I know what you mean, Deborah, and don't worry, it's not you. An experienced lawyer knows how to remain unaccountable for whatever they're doing. It's the first thing we learned," James confessed. "Now here's what I want you to do." As he began laying out the details, Carol came into the living room. Deborah beckoned for her to sit down, then she interrupted James. "Carol just came in, James. I'm putting you on speaker." Then they both listened as he advised them on what to do and how to go about doing it. "Are you sure? Because it could take some time doing it this way," Deborah asked. "I realize that, Deborah, but after all is said and done, it's really up to Albert, right? We can spare you here at the firm. If that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. Just so long as we get this thing done right," James answered. "All right, James. We'll keep you updated as things happen," Deborah said. He said good luck before he said goodbye. Then they hung up. Deborah sat back for a few seconds thinking about his instructions. "Figures him thinking I'm worried about being away from the firm. Girl, I'm thinking about getting back to my husband," Deborah remarked. Carol had remained silent throughout the entire call. She was feeling intimidated because of the level of conversation between them. Now she finally had something that she could relate to in Deborah's last statement. She started thinking about ways she could help the situation. Luckily, because most of what James said went over her head, she was unconsciously preoccupied with the advice given to addicts in recovery, in particular the acronym KISS, short for Keep It Simple, Stupid. Then she had an idea. "Look, Deborah, it's like this. Aunt Thelma got us into this, right? Well, then Aunt Thelma can get us out of it." "What do you mean?" Deborah asked. Then Carol told Deborah her idea. It was 10 o'clock in the morning when Albert Bradley finally arrived at the firm. It was late, although he had woken up early, intent on enjoying his morning. He was taking his time preparing an elaborate breakfast for his date from last night, so he was not answering his phone. She told him her name when they met at the nightclub, but he couldn't remember it now. All he remembered was that she was some kind of model, though he'd never seen any of her work. He always let the women he brought home sleep as long as they wanted the morning after, not wanting to rush them out the door, in case they ever met again. Truth was, he just wanted to make sure that she was out of the oceanfront condo before he left, and that she didn't take anything with her that she didn't bring. A friend once suggested to him that he find a better class of girl to bring home, so that he didn't have to worry about her stealing from him. His reply was, "Oh, I do prefer the better class girls, but they also have to be gone before I leave." Albert had spent a considerable amount of his time nurturing his reputation with the Jacksonville nightclub crowd in the years both before and after he graduated from law school. He discovered that he was able to claim any money that he spent at the club as a business expense when he filed his taxes, claiming that he was there to find clients and as a part of developing his legal reputation in Jacksonville. As he strode into the firm feeling full of himself, Margaret quickly greeted him before he had a chance to say anything. It was their private code for letting him know that something was going on. "Good morning, Mr. Bradley. This is Mr. Robinson," she said, gesturing in the direction of the elderly gentleman sitting in the waiting area. When he noticed the strained look on her face as she introduced him, he instantly knew that the man had been waiting there to see him for some time. The Bradley firm maintained a cadre of 8 lawyers, and while they weren't a firm of ambulance chasers, each lawyer was responsible for bringing in an unspecified amount of revenue each month. So the turnover rate at his firm was high. Because this man had been waiting, Albert knew that it was because he wanted to see him personally. He privately cursed himself for not putting in the private entrance to his office, which he'd been planning on doing but never followed through on. Now it just went to the top of his to-do list. He shifted his briefcase to his other hand, walking up to Carl, and extended his right hand. "Good morning, sir. Albert Bradley. I'm sorry you had to wait. I got the call you were here, but I was tied up in court and couldn't get away. I'm sure you understand. What can I do for you?" "I'm Carl Robinson. I own the St. John's grocery store over in the village. I want to talk with you about my niece, Carol." Albert was caught completely off guard by what he'd heard. He'd assessed the man he was talking to as soon as he came in and saw him waiting in the lobby. Dressed in the typical workman's dark blue pants, matching shirt, and worn boots, only thing missing was the patch on his shirt with his name on it. Albert immediately assumed that he was a regular working man. The name Robinson didn't even register to him as the man being one of the real Robinsons of Jacksonville. And shaking his rough, calloused hand, confirmed to Albert that he was not a potential VIP client. But when he heard the word St. John's, he suddenly realized that he was wrong about the man. St. John's was the name of the most affluent area in Jacksonville, the equivalent of Beverly Hills in Los Angeles. Albert didn't know it, but from the moment he walked into the waiting room, he was also being assessed by Carl, and was engaged in a battle that he'd already lost. When Thelma took the call from Carol and Deborah, telling her of James's plan for them to recoup the money that Albert failed to pay them for their consulting services, she came up with a plan of her own after they hung up. Her plan involved Carl, dressed like a regular working man, being there at the Bradley firm before they opened so that he could have the psychological upper hand on Albert, who, no matter what time he got there, would be made to feel like he was late in meeting with Carl. Then, after telling Albert that if he didn't pay Carol what he owed her, he would have no chance of landing the Robinson account. During the call, Carol told Thelma that she and Deborah hadn't yet discussed anything about finishing the account with Albert because they'd only finished it early Saturday morning. So Carl already knew that Albert had no idea that the Robinson account had been completed, and giving him the heads up should be all it would take to encourage him to do the right thing by Carol and Deborah. Albert being late coming to work was icing on the cake and the biggest leverage that he surrendered to Carl. Thelma's plan hinged on Carl being at the firm before Albert arrived, so he had been sitting in the parking lot since 6 that morning. Albert, now realizing that he'd misjudged the man and that he was a VIP, began backpedaling, a victim of his own presumptions. "Oh, Mr. Robinson, yes, how nice to finally meet you, sir," Albert cheerfully said. Carl inwardly snickered. Even though Albert's being late was good for him, Carl was ticked off by it and feeling snarky at having to wait for hours. "Oh, really? How so? Have you done business with my store? I think I would have remembered doing business with you, but I can't recall having ever met you before." Carl was enjoying touring with him. No, sir. I apologize for the confusion. I meant that I have heard about you through your niece, Carol. She is the most promising new member of our team here, and her training is surpassing all of our expectations. We are very lucky to have her," Albert explained. Then, without giving him a chance to respond, and feeling as though he'd gained control of the pace of the conversation, Albert continued. "Let's go into my office where we can talk. Margaret, hold my calls, please." He stood to the side and extended his hand to usher Carl towards his office. Then he made the critical mistake of asking Carl a question. "Can I offer you something to drink? Some coffee, perhaps?" Carl stepped back, away from Albert's outstretched arm, and now that he'd been given the chance to respond, it was Carl who set the tempo of the conversation. The first thing that changed was his vernacular. "No, thank you. I can't stay any longer. Margaret already took good care of me before you arrived, and provided me with several cups of coffee earlier, thank you." Albert looked over at Margaret, who was beaming, and nodded to her. "I just came to find out how you do business here, and to make sure that my niece was involved with the right kind of people. We're not in the habit of turning our business dealings over to just anyone. You know, we are very proud of Carol. Her mother was a lawyer, you know." "No, Albert caught himself, realizing that what he was about to finish saying was in no way helpful to him. "She's come a long way," Carl continued, acting as if he didn't hear Albert at all. "I understand that she and Deborah stand to make quite a lot of money from their consulting firm, am I right?" Carl asked. Now it was Carl's turn to continue talking without waiting for a response. "We are very proud of both of them, but I won't be keeping you any longer, Mr. Bradley. I know you have a lot of things to take care of, representing all of the Robinson businesses. It's been a pleasure meeting you." Carl extended his hand, and after shaking Albert's, he turned and left the office. Albert was left standing in his waiting room, holding his briefcase, trying to process what had just happened to him. Then he realized that Margaret was looking at him, seeing him confused. He immediately shifted his briefcase back to his other hand, then smoothed out his tie, trying to regain his confident composure. "Is Carol here?" he asked Margaret on his way to his office. "Yes, Mr. Bradley. She and Deborah have been here since we opened," she replied. "Did he speak with them?" Albert asked, stopping and turning around to look at Margaret. "No, sir. He came in after they arrived and specifically asked me not to let them know he was here," she said. "Well, just let them know I'm here, okay, Margaret?" Albert said, continuing on his way to his office. Walking towards his office, he started thinking again about getting a contractor to begin work on the private entrance to his office. "Do you want me to send them to your office, Mr. Bradley?" Margaret inquired. No, just let them know. But just in passing, Margaret, just in passing, that's all." In truth, he wanted nothing more than to find out that they were finished working on the Robinson account, but he didn't want to reveal how badly he wanted to Carol and Deborah, especially knowing how he shortchanged them on their fee. Before he entered his office, he turned to Margaret. "Can you dig up the statement of account for DC Consulting and bring it to my office?" Albert asked. "Sure thing, Mr. Bradley. I started working on it a few minutes ago," she answered, not looking up from her computer screen. Chapter 41. The Robinson Account. While on their morning break from training, Deborah and Carol stopped off at Margaret's desk and requested to have a meeting with Albert after lunch. She contacted him by intercom and was instructed to tell him that he was free to meet with them now. As the two women entered his office, he greeted them at the door cheerfully. "Please come in and take a seat, won't you? I won't keep you. I know it's your break." They instantly had the same feeling of misgiving and glanced at one another, confirming one another's suspicions. He was being too cheerful, and they both knew something was up. "Said the spider to the fly," Deborah mused as she walked through the office door. Albert rose from his chair behind his desk as they entered, and gestured for them to sit. She and Carol said good morning at the same time as they took a seat. "I had a visit from your Uncle Carl this morning, Carol," he said matter-of-factly before sitting back down behind his desk. "He wanted to know how your training was coming along," Albert said, without the slightest hint that he was lying. He was doing his best to find out the status of the Robinson account from them without coming right out and asking. So he kept the focus of the conversation on Carol's training for the time being. He continued talking, not waiting for Carol to respond. "Your family is very proud of you, and I told them how lucky we are to have you. Did either of you know he was here this morning?" This was the moment that Albert had been setting up. The moment when he would find out if he was being played by the two women. He was paying close attention to the way Carol reacted to his question. He realized that if she knew that Carl came to the firm, it stood to reason that she would also know why he was here. He watched for her reaction, while at the same time watching for Deborah's. What he saw told him that they truly had no idea that Carl had been there. He noted in particular that Carol's obvious surprise and confusion at the news was sincere. That, too, was a part of Thelma's plan, and the main reason why she never told Carol or Deborah anything about her new plan. "So, how is the training coming along? What can I tell Mr. Robinson when he returns?" Albert asked, weaving another lie as he turned, shifting his focus to Deborah. "We are almost finished. Carol knows your law library back to front. You can ask her anything," Deborah responded. "No, that's not necessary. I'm confident that she's in capable hands, Deborah. That's why I asked you here. I just wanted to touch base with y'all to make sure everything was going well." Another lie. Following James's plan, Deborah took the opportunity to announce that they'd completed preparing the documents for the Robinson account. "Oh, really? That's great news." Then Albert depressed the button on his intercom. "Margaret, can you send me the statement of the account for DC Consulting?" He immediately pressed the mute button on the intercom so that no response from Margaret would be heard. Then he looked intently at his computer screen. "So, what was the final tally? Because we got to get y'all paid in full," Albert asked, nonchalantly, seemingly preoccupied with what was on his computer screen. Deborah picked up and then placed her briefcase in her lap and opened it. She took out the file for the Robinson account. Before she opened it, she glanced at Carol. James's plan called for Deborah to mistakenly give him a much smaller total than the true one, a total so small that Albert would be compelled to look closer at the figures. "The figure should be so small that he realizes he's overpaid you," James told him. It would then prompt him to bring up the contract to revisit the amount that he'd already paid. Then Deborah was to catch her mistake and disclose the true total. At that point, Albert would have both the amount that he'd already paid them and the amount the account was really worth together on his desk in front of him at the same time. This was the part in the plan where Albert would reveal his true color and would either hold them to their contracted amount or pay them what was right. James had Deborah create two files. One, a blue folder, with the asset total that equaled what he paid them, and another, green folder, with the correct total asset amount. It was a brilliant plan. Now, with Albert offering to pay them in full, Deborah took out the green folder. Carol smiled and exhaled as she bounced her tightly clasped hands on her knee when she saw the green folder. Deborah opened it and read aloud. $117,342.62. She handed the file over the desk to him and was again surprised when he showed no reaction to the total. He never even looked away from his computer screen as he accepted the file from her. So on top of the previous payment, let's just call that a retainer fee, okay? So including that, the amount you are due at 2% comes out to just under $2,305,000. Does that sound right? Then he looked up at the two women. To be honest, Mr. Bradley, that amount sounds a little heavy, but it sure sounds good, Deborah said. Well, positive thoughts create positive outcomes, I like to say, Deborah, and we always look out for our people here at the Bradley firm. You are one of our people, right, Carol? He wanted to make sure that Carl got his message just like he got Carl's. I'm working on it, Mr. Bradley, Carol responded. You're going to do just fine here, Carol. I can feel it in my bones. And look, the deposit just posted to your account. Albert had begun working on the account since earlier when Margaret brought him the statement not long after Carl had left earlier that morning. He could not afford to let anything jeopardize landing this account, especially not one of his own underhanded schemes. The reason he muted the intercom was so that they would not hear Margaret tell him that she had sent the information to him hours before, and that the deposit transaction to DC Consulting had already been started and only needed him to input the amount. Now, he turned his laptop around so the ladies could see the confirmation notice on the screen. Well, now that that's concluded, I've got some work to do on this account, so I won't keep you any further. And please do feel free to adjust the time and take your complete break, ladies. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must get back to other matters. Albert turned his laptop back around and picked up the file. Deborah and Carol got up to leave, heading to the door, when he reminded Deborah, Deborah, none of this has any effect on our arrangement for you being here to train Carol. I just want to make sure that is clear. She thanked him on her way out of the office. No, really, thank you, Deborah. Which was the only completely honest thing he'd said all day up until that point. Less than 30 seconds after Deborah pulled the door closed behind them, he heard a shriek come from the waiting room. For a split second, he thought to call Margaret to see what was wrong, but when he looked at the intercom, he smiled, then depressed the mute button. Chapter 42. New Beginnings. The first thing Deborah did after leaving Albert's office was to call Travis. She was the one driving as she and Carol went to lunch, so she put the phone on speaker. She motioned for Carol to stay quiet. Grinning with anticipation of what was going to happen, Carol nodded. I've got some good news, Travis, Deborah said. You're finished and you're coming home, he guessed in response. No, we're not finished yet, but we are millionaires. Now that's something you can tell Paul, she responded. Travis remained quiet on the other end. He was waiting for the punchline to the joke. He waited. Still nothing. For real, Travis. I'm not playing around, Deborah added. You lying. Stop lying, Deborah. We are what? Who? What? What? We are what? Travis asked again, and even though he was still talking, he was speechless. Deborah told him what happened after they completed the Robinson account, then told him that she would be coming home next Friday after she finished training Carol. He never stopped asking questions after that, and she finally had to tell him that she had to get back to work, but they would talk again later. After she hung up with Travis, she and Carol had a good laugh in the drive-thru. Carol also made a call and shared the news with Denise. Because Denise was in between classes, they didn't have much time to talk. Carol ended her call telling her not to tell anyone because people change when they find out you have money. I know exactly what you mean, Mom, Denise said, thinking about how that's exactly what happened to her on campus. The rest of the day's training at the firm went by quickly, and after they left work, Deborah helped Carol move out of the shelter and into a hotel near the college. Carol reconsidered getting an apartment after Deborah reminded her that she would more than likely have to sign a lease. Carol had no idea yet what her long-term plans were, so she settled on a hotel suite instead. Deborah left after dropping her off at the hotel on her way to meet with Gary. While she was settling into her room, Carol called Denise, then Aunt Thelma, telling them where she'd moved to. Before she told Aunt Thelma how the meeting turned out, she remembered what Albert said earlier and asked if she knew anything about Uncle Carl being at the firm that morning. That's when Aunt Thelma told her about what she had done after they talked about James's plan, having Carl show up there to get Albert to pay up. Carol was truly amazed at how crafty Aunt Thelma was, then excitedly told her about the meeting and how much money she and Deborah made. Until that moment, she'd only respected Aunt Thelma as an elder, but now, as she started to get some idea of how incredibly smart and resourceful she really was, Carol began respecting and admiring Aunt Thelma as much as she respected and admired Deborah. They continued talking for hours more, Thelma telling her stories of her mother and father back when she was a baby, and they all lived in Jacksonville. They would have talked longer, but she heard Uncle Carl in the background, demanding that Thelma put down the phone and pay him some attention. Suddenly, she heard Uncle Carl's voice on the phone. "Whoever this is, she gonna have to call you back later," and hung up. Now that she was off work and had more time, Deborah called Travis. This time, she was able to answer all of his questions. She mentioned to him that she wanted to have a celebration dinner with his father and James when she returned. He said that was a great idea and that he would take care of the reservations. "Pick the best restaurant in town, not some cheapo place," Deborah urged. "But of course, only the best for my millionaire wife," Travis responded lightheartedly. They both laughed, hanging up. Then Deborah called James and filled him in on everything that happened. "I knew it would work out for you if you just did what I said," James said, still feeling proud of his plan. "He came clean, though. I couldn't believe it. He was trying to pay us as soon as we told him we were done," Deborah said. "Well, that's even better," James said, happy to have his faith in his frat brother restored. Still unaware that it was Thelma's plan that worked on Albert, Deborah ended the call, telling him that she would be returning the following Friday afternoon. She asked if he would be interested in joining them for a celebration dinner. "As long as you're buying, I'll be there," James said cheerfully. After they hung up, she called Gary to set up a time to meet and finally have some mother and son quality time to spend together. He was excited about the idea and suggested they do it as soon as possible because he had some good news that he wanted to share with her, too. Because of his new schedule as manager trainee, he didn't get off until 7 o'clock. It gave Deborah enough time to get ready and to be there to pick him up as soon as he got off. She was sure that telling him how much money she made was better than his news, so she didn't press him for details about his good news, instead choosing to wait to find out when they met for dinner. When she pulled up to the grocery store, she learned that Thelma and Carl had already left, leaving Gary and Tony there to lock up the store. Deborah had been looking forward to talking with Thelma after their meeting with Albert, but she knew she would have plenty of time to do it later. After dropping Tony off at the apartment, she and Gary went to dinner. They enjoyed their drive to the restaurant, with Gary telling his mother all about his second day as assistant manager, and having learned that because he was only 17 years old, by law, Aunt Thelma and Uncle Carl were not able to make his promotion official until he was at least 18 years old. It was only 3 months away, so he said he had no problem with it because it was only fair, and he was happy for Tony, who was old enough to begin working in the position as soon as their training was over. "Tony needs this, Mom, more than I do," Gary told her. She stole a glance at her son as he spoke, recalling the time when she found him at home playing his video game after he dropped out of school years ago. She marveled at how mature her son had become in the time they were apart. Gary continued talking about his day on the way to the restaurant. Deborah was curious about his good news, but realized he was waiting until they were seated at the table before he told her. Just like back in the day, she thought, feeling the warm glow of nostalgia. And then she smiled, realizing how much she really missed the time that they used to spend together when he was younger. After they were seated and their meal was brought to the table, he began telling his good news. First of all, let me say I didn't say anything about it before until we were sure, and Denise deserves all the credit for this. Again, Deborah became nostalgic, remembering how much Denise helped her to see herself in the not-so-distant past. How so, son? Deborah asked. He explained how Denise was having problems with some kids at school and how he and Tony volunteered to go to the school to set them straight. One thing led to another, and then she suggested that they attend college themselves. So, Tony and I are applying to college as soon as we finish assistant manager training, probably in a couple of weeks, Mom. She had only taken her first bite of food and stopped chewing. She stared at him in amazement and tried to talk, forgetting that she had a mouthful of food. Deborah murmured. She hurriedly took a drink of water and washed the food down. "You gonna do what? Oh my God, Gary, that's fantastic," Deborah said excitedly. "Denise is gonna walk us through what we have to do. Tony is going too, Mom." "Wait until Travis hears about this," she added. "Denise also said that we could get financial aid, so we wouldn't have to pay a lot of money to go. And she said Aunt Thelma and Uncle Carl are some kind of big shots at the school, so we're sure to get in," Gary added. Deborah stifled a snicker after Gary said financial aid because of how excited he was. Then she decided not to tell him that she was a millionaire. No amount of money, she decided, is better than what he is telling me. Gary kept talking as they continued their meal, eventually asking how things were going with her. Deborah responded only by telling him that she and Carol had finally finished their work as DC Consulting and that she was due to leave Jacksonville next Friday after she finished training Carol. She invited him to the celebration for Carol becoming a paralegal. He said of course, and then congratulated her on finishing up with the Robinson account. Deborah asked whether he had any plans on what he wanted to take in college. He said that he didn't know for sure, but he did know that he did not want to enter anybody's spelling bee. They both laughed and continued enjoying their meal together. Chapter 43. Leaving Jacksonville. The next morning, after Deborah picked up Carol from her hotel, she was told about Aunt Thelma and Uncle Carl's involvement in getting Albert to pay them. "So that's why he was there. I kind of thought that was just another one of Albert's lies," Deborah said. "Girl, that's right. That man lies just to lie. But let me tell you what Aunt Thelma says about him." At that point, Deborah stopped listening to Carol. But it wasn't that she was ignoring her. Deborah had become aware of the difference in Carol's voice as she talked about Aunt Thelma now as compared to before. She could hear the newfound respect and admiration that she had for Thelma, and it made her happy that Carol was finally at home and happy to be with her people. That was the main thing that Deborah wanted when she talked to Travis about bringing her to Jacksonville with them from Philly. What a great start to the day, she thought. Then she thought, no matter what else happens throughout the rest of this day, nothing can top this feeling. As she stopped musing, she tuned back into what Carol was saying. "So we shouldn't hold it against him that he lies like that, because we can count on him to do the same kind of thing to get the most that he can for the Robinson family businesses that he represents, too." Deborah had only caught the tail end of what Aunt Thelma told her, but it was enough for Deborah to know that it was the truth. Lawyers are gonna lawyer, she thought, and lying was just a part of the occupation. She was feeling so happy for Carol that she almost didn't hear when Carol asked if she would not mind taking her to look at cars during their lunch break. "Of course, Carol, I'd love to, girl," Deborah said excitedly. Deborah was very excited at the prospect of actually being there when Carol put down the money to buy an expensive car outright, with cash, like a big baller. She imagined Carol buying a car that reflected their success with DC Consulting, something flashy and obscenely expensive. The fantasy carried Deborah through the whole morning, and as lunchtime approached, Her anticipation was peaking. She stopped short of rushing Carol, but wanted nothing more than to tell her to walk faster. Then, to her complete and utter disappointment, Carol chose a moderately priced regular vehicle. As they waited for the dealer to return with the paperwork, Deborah looked over at Carol, standing there waiting patiently, and realized that she had as much to learn from Carol as Carol was learning from her. Carol's training lasted until Friday, by which time, and in no small part to the success of their consulting firm, she had gained the confidence to be able to do the job herself, unsupervised, which she had been struggling with all during her training, but never said anything for fear of disappointing Deborah. Albert gave Carol a half day off to celebrate her completing training. Thelma and Carl arranged for a buffet at the beachfront restaurant, and most of the family showed up. Everyone congratulated her on her accomplishment and thanked her for bringing the Robinson family dynasty into existence. Deborah had already made arrangements with Albert for her to leave Jacksonville that coming Friday, and by that afternoon, Gary and Denise accompanied them as Carol drove her to the airport in her new car. Everyone in the car was happy and talking, but as they neared the airport, Deborah suddenly began sobbing and crying. Alarmed, Carol pulled over to the shoulder of the road to comfort her, and along with everyone else, asking what was the matter. Gary leaned forward and held his mother's shoulders from the back seat. He glanced at Denise, seeing that she was alarmed and scared. He took her hand and held it tightly. Carol took off her seatbelt and turned in her seat to face Deborah, who had her head buried in her lap, sobbing uncontrollably. "Mom? Mom?" Gary asked, concerned. The worry in his voice was unmistakable. He looked at Carol, not knowing what else to do. Carol reached over and put her hand on Deborah's shoulder, finally realizing what was happening. "Girl, we are all here, and we ain't going nowhere. You can come down any time, you know that. Philly ain't nowhere from here. We gonna visit you so much you gonna be tired of seeing us. This is my family. I I can't leave," Deborah sobbed. "Maybe you and Travis can just move down here, Mom," Gary said encouragingly. "Yeah, he can transfer to the post office here, and you can work at the firm with Mom, and we can all be together," Denise innocently added. Then Deborah stopped crying and sat up, looking back at Denise, surprised. "That's right. We can do that," Deborah said, then looked at Carol. "Girl, why didn't you think of that?" she asked. "I've been thinking that, but I know how you need to get back to Travis, so I ain't say nothing. And ain't no question that Albert will take you at the firm, girl, 'cause Lord knows he need help, child," Carol said enthusiastically. She and Carol started laughing. Deborah collected herself and wiped her tears, then straightened out her outfit. "This much is true, girl. This much is true," Deborah said. Carol sat back in her seat, putting on her seatbelt. She put the car in gear. "Where to, then?" Carol asked, looking over at Deborah before she started driving. "I still got a flight to catch today, but we will be coming back," Deborah answered. In the back seat, Gary and Denise cheered, and Carol pulled onto the highway. "That's my girl," Carol cheered. They stayed with Deborah until her flight took off. As Carol, Gary, and Denise walked back to the parking garage through the airport, they passed through the aromas of so many different food concessions when Carol's stomach growled. "Who wants pizza?" Both Gary and Denise, also hungry from the smell, raised their hands. "We do!" "I have free pay-per-view at the hotel. Y'all ready to make a night of it?" Carol asked, already knowing the answer. Denise shrieked in approval. "Oh, it's on," Gary added. Then all three of them took off running through the airport at full speed. Carol outran both of them to the car. Chapter 44. Homecoming. Deborah's flight from Jacksonville arrived in Philly on time, and she was met by Travis, and he had Paul with him. She was wearing her sunglasses as she walked up to greet them, and had the opportunity to look closely at Paul. As he watched her approach, his face said it all. He wore the same look of disdain for her that she had seen the first time they met one another at the wedding, and like she felt it coming off of him then, the closer she got to him, the stronger the feeling of his dislike for her became. She rushed up and into Travis's arms, holding him. Turning her head, she looked at Paul, who didn't see her looking because he was looking up as he rolled his eyes. Then she turned into Travis's neck. "Nothing's changed," she whispered as they hugged one another. He squeezed her tighter, letting her know that not only had he heard her, but at the same time letting her know that he knew it already. As they broke their embrace, Travis turned to Paul. "Dad, you know Deborah," Travis said. "Hello, Deborah. It's so good to see you again," Paul said warmly. If she had not already seen him rolling his eyes, she would have never doubted the sincerity of his words. So he's a slick one, she thought. She had not seen her husband in 3 weeks at this point, and now she was regretting having set the dinner date before she had a chance to spend some time with him. Making matters worse was having to spend time with Paul, of all people, before she could be alone with Travis. Deborah knew that as the evening wore on, she was going to become salty, but she couldn't do anything to stop it. She needed to be alone with Travis to do that. She did what she could to prevent Paul from saying anything that was going to set her off. "So, Paul, Travis tells me that you're retired from the Postal Service. I bet you have a million stories about your time there. I'd love to hear them," she said. Travis grinned. "Oh, I had a great career at the post office," Paul said, animated now, and continued talking as they started walking. Deborah was relieved when he took the bait and started talking. She was only thinking about being alone with Travis. It took them a while to reach their car as they walked through the state's biggest airport, and Paul talked the entire way. As they approached the vehicle, Travis had to interrupt him. "The reservations are for 7, so that gives us a half an hour to kill. Do you want to go to the house and freshen up, baby?" "Yes, please. Oh, but let me call James first to tell him about the time," Deborah responded. "I took care of that already. Remember we talked about it?" Travis said. "I'm sorry I didn't remember, Travis. It must be the jet lag." "Travis is always good at remembering things. He's been good like that since he was a boy," Paul said, interrupting their conversation. Travis and Deborah froze when Paul spoke, both of them looking at him as if he'd just pulled a pin on a hand grenade and hadn't yet thrown it. "The way y'all looking at me right now says a lot. We're going to have a good time tonight, so y'all can relax, because we ain't going to let that elephant in the room bother us. Deborah, I promise I'm going to be on my best behavior, because my son loves you. That much I do know. So we ain't going to allow my hang-ups to be y'all's problems. Not tonight, okay?" Paul said. They remained frozen, only now it was because of Paul's sincerity. "Come on, y'all, just relax," he repeated, opening the door to the back seat and getting in the car. Standing on the driver's side, Travis looked at Deborah over the roof of the car and then just raised both hands up, staring at her with eyebrows as high on his face as they could go, his eyes wide, and shaking his head as if to say, "I don't even know." Then she and Travis got into the car. Leaving the airport, they ran into traffic and were sitting in silence for a few minutes when Deborah took off her seatbelt and turned in her seat to face Paul. "What did you mean by your hang-ups, Paul?" Deborah innocently asked, the pending saltiness of her attitude having already arrived. Travis glanced at her, making the chopping gesture with his hand so that his father couldn't see it from the back seat. Paul was looking out the window, then turned and looked at Deborah. "My hang-ups are with women," Paul said matter-of-factly. Ever since Teresa, Travis's mother, did he tell you about his mother? Well, there's only so much he could say. He was still a baby when she took off and left us. This ain't the time, Pop, Travis said threateningly. No, please, tell me. Travis really hasn't told me much about his mother, other than she left y'all when he was young. Travis glared at Deborah as the car sat unmoving in traffic. That is what happened, but there's more to it than just that. Stands to reason that it would take more than just that for somebody to develop a hang-up, don't you think? Paul asked. Deborah, still facing the rear of the car, continued looking at him, waiting for him to continue. She waited, but he remained silent, looking out his window. Now she looked at Travis, confused. He turned and looked at her. He really didn't want the conversation to continue, knowing how likely his father would be to say the wrong thing, but the look on her face compelled him. He knew what to do, and looked up in the rearview mirror. He saw him looking out the window and said, Yes, it does stand to reason, Pop. Then, while looking out the window, Paul started talking again. Me and Teresa met in our last year in high school, and we became boyfriend and girlfriend. But we were on and off all the time, in the beginning. Sometimes she'd get mad if she saw me talking to another girl, and sometimes she just didn't want to be in a relationship anymore. We always made up after a week, sometimes just a few days, but she always came back. Paul paused, saying it as if he were defending her and explaining something at the same time. She always did. Then he grew silent, still looking out the window, and remained silent. Deborah looked over at Travis. He could see that she was looking at him out of the corner of his eye, but he just looked ahead, keeping his eyes on the road. A few moments later, Paul suddenly started talking again, but now rapidly, like someone reciting a painful memory. Yeah, she always came back, and then, after we graduated, I started working at the post office, and we became a solid thing. Everything was good up until the cops killed that pregnant woman in '64. Then after that, they never proved that, Pop, Travis interrupted, already knowing where the story was going. Your mama thought it to be true, son. That's all that matters, Paul responded, turning now from looking out the window and looking instead at the back of his son's head in the front seat. After that, she was always fighting against something or for something, school buses, civil rights. She stayed involved in something. Then he paused again and turned back to the window. This time Deborah only waited for him to begin again. When he did, his tone was calmer, and he returned to talking slowly. We got married, bought our house, and everything was wonderful. She stayed home taking care of the house, and I was working, trying to get promoted to supervisor. She wanted to work, but I kept telling her I was going to get the promotion, and then we'd have so much money we could buy anything we wanted. Wasn't long after, though, that she got mixed up with another group of Black Panthers or something. It was the MOVE organization, Pop, Travis said, correcting him for Deborah's sake. Whatever it was some angry, poor black people, and she ain't had no business being with them. We lived good, and Philly wasn't one of those cities where black folk got fed up and was rioting because they was treated badly. Everybody was equal back in those days, no problems. But she kept running with them in that MOVE organization. She finally settled down after she got pregnant with Travis. For a time, we were together closer than any two people ever been. When Travis was born, she was happy, and she doted on that boy. Then, after Travis turned 3, she started going out again, hanging with that girlfriend of hers that was in the MOVE organization. Then, one night, she came into the house, her face showing fear. She said she had to leave, and for me not to try to stop her or follow her. I had Travis in the bathtub. He was still too small to be left to wash up alone, and before I could finish, she was gone. I ran outside as soon as I could and saw a car speeding around the corner. I stayed watching until the smoke from the tires finally disappeared, and that was the last time I saw her. The next day, the news showed how the cops dropped a bomb on the house where Move was. They burned down the whole neighborhood over there. I used to wait, knowing she would return to us, but hours turned into days, into months, and now it's been 21 years. Deborah was stunned. She was sitting backward in her seat looking at Paul, her back leaning against the dashboard. She looked at her husband in amazement because now so much about him became instantly clear. She now understood where the values that they shared came from. Then she looked again at Paul, seeing him through a completely different set of eyes. "And you are waiting for her to come back, aren't you?" Deborah asked, understanding it as she did. "Of course we are. She's my wife and his mother. Yes, it's true, she may be a little confused right now, but we're still in the same place, so she knows where to find us. When you marry someone, you marry them for life." Deborah remembered Travis saying this many, many times before they divorced, and was the reason why it hurt her so much when she got the divorce papers. She never expected it from him. Now she noticed that the traffic jam had ended some time while Paul was talking. She glanced at Travis. His eyes were on the road as he drove, shaking his head in agreement with what his father was saying. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She suddenly understood what she hadn't understood in the airport garage. It was that the elephant in the room Paul was talking about was her. She then turned around in her seat, putting on the seatbelt. Then she turned her head and calmly said to Paul, "You were right, Paul. I wasn't good enough for Travis. I might not even be good enough for him now." "Deborah!" Travis shouted, snapping his head to look at her. "You don't have to say that to—" "I left you, Travis. That's a fact," Deborah said, interrupting him. Now, it was Deborah who just looked forward. "Sure, you moved out, but we both knew where you were going. But when I moved, I was angry, making sure you would not find where Gary and I went. And now that I know what you and your father have been through, I agree with him," Deborah confessed. Paul turned and looked at her intently. She turned away, looking out her window, feeling like she was not able to handle him looking at her. "I'm not worthy to look him in the eye," she thought. The drive continued, though now in silence. Deborah wanted to turn around again, but she could feel Paul still staring at her and didn't even try to glance. Finally, Travis broke the silence. "I told you, Pop, now was not the time," he said, sounding defeated. "Maybe not for you, son, but I learned something. This woman that you married is a better woman than your mama ever was, I can tell you that," Paul responded calmly. Deborah was shocked. She snapped her head around and saw Paul, his head turned, staring out the window. Then she remembered how slick he could be when saying things, so she kept looking at him. After a minute, he turned his head slowly and looked at her. She looked him in the eye, and now she saw admiration in his eyes where she once saw disdain. Then he turned away, again looking out the window. "And something else we did, Travis. We got rid of that damn elephant, I can tell you that too," Paul added. Deborah turned in her seat and looked forward. She kept her fist clenched, pressing it into her thigh because it was taking everything that she had not to cry again, for the same exact reason she cried in the car with Carol earlier that same day. "I hear you, Pop," Travis said approvingly as they made their way home on the crowded Philadelphia expressway. Chapter 45. Dinner Table Talk. With only minutes to spare before their reservation, Deborah, Travis, and Paul approached James, who was waiting near the entrance to the restaurant. "I was worried y'all weren't going to show. I've been here 20 minutes already, and let me tell you, I am hungry," James said, happy to see them. "James, this is my father, Paul," Travis said. And my father-in-law, Deborah proudly added. Freeing her arm from Travis's, Deborah rushed around James on her tippy toes so that she didn't break a heel, her red dress billowing out like a muleta to come up and put her arm through Paul's. Everyone was startled by her sudden flurry of activity, including Paul, who then smiled, placing his free hand on Deborah's arms and straightening up. "Oh, it's like that now?" Travis asked jokingly. "It's just like that," Deborah jokingly replied. Deborah raised her free arm, pointing upward, waving it back and forth and laughing, walking arm in arm with Paul. Travis followed, looking with deep feelings of admiration and love for his father, as he watched Paul, now smiling broadly, walking with a swagger and his chest out, proudly escorting his daughter-in-law to the entrance of the restaurant. James, walking next to Travis, leaned over and put a hand on Travis's shoulder. "Your pop still got it, I see," he said. Both men started laughing as they walked side by side, following Paul and Deborah through the restaurant door, being held open by the doorman. Once they had been seated and ordered their meals, they had a carafe of wine and glasses brought to the table. Travis started off asking Deborah about Gary. She had already told him over the phone everything that was happening with Gary, but neither Paul nor James knew, so she took the hint and told them about Gary passing his GED, and how the store owners, Carl and Thelma, promoted him and his roommate to assistant managers. Then she told him that he had recently applied to college. After she finished, surprisingly, it was Paul who spoke first. "I remember seeing that young man at the wedding. He was the one standing next to Travis at the ceremony, am I right?" "Yes, Pop, that was Gary." Only now did it dawn on Deborah that Paul had never met Gary. Travis was also reminded how little his father knew about his stepson. He recalled how when he and Deborah first met, he'd intentionally kept Paul out of their lives, knowing of his father's reluctance to accept anyone in Travis's life that would seemingly interfere with his plans for Travis. Then, with Paul making it clear that he wanted nothing to do with their remarriage, he never allowed him the opportunity to explain anything about his stepson. And to further the gap, he was not even aware that Gary had run away from home until the night he and Deborah met again, as he was delivering the letter. "So, how did he come to be living in Jacksonville? Is he there with his father?" Paul asked. Deborah tensed up, then looked at Travis. The look in his eyes told her that Paul was not taking a jab at her. She relaxed and thought about it, realizing that it really was a perfectly normal assumption. But Deborah took too much time to answer Paul's question, and James excitedly jumped at the opportunity to retell his part in the amazing events that happened. Paul put down his wine glass, then put his hands together under his chin. Looking squarely at Travis and Deborah, he calmly said, "I just met him, so I don't know how much wine your friend can handle, but it doesn't seem like much. So I ask you, is any part of that crazy story he just told me true?" Paul asked. They all started laughing, startling and drawing attention from the other diners in the posh, expensive restaurant. James looked around the restaurant and saw the others looking at them with snobbish disapproval. "It's true. Can't take y'all nowhere," James said, laughing. Everyone at the table erupted again into even louder laughter. It lasted for a few moments. Then Paul got everyone started again, saying, "It was just like this at the wedding," he reminded them. At this, the three began laughing again uncontrollably now. There was not even a hope in trying to maintain decorum, as they laughed remembering what happened. Their laughter now became infectious, and those dining at the tables nearest to them slowly began laughing too. As long as Travis and Deborah and James laughed, so did the people around them. It went on for a while longer, then they quieted down. As they composed themselves, all wiping tears from their eyes, Travis spoke in between snickers. "Deb, it's your story, baby. You tell it." So, She told Paul the story starting from when she and Travis first met, leaving out any parts involving Sam. That could come later, she thought to herself as she spoke. She continued telling Paul the details of how Gary came to be living in Jacksonville as the waiters began bringing their meals. When she finished, James repeated the parts where he came in on the story, giving his version of the events, highlighting his experience with Deborah, starting with her testimony at church. He ended his part in the story saying how he's come to regard Travis and Deborah as family rather than just friends. Paul listened intently as he ate, shaking his head when pieces to the story that he was familiar with were now fully understood. Travis sat next to James listening and looking at the other side of the table where Paul sat next to Deborah. His father was almost a completely different person, he realized as he watched him. He was never one to socialize, and getting him out of the house for anything other than work rarely ever happened. Even getting him to come to the dinner took a lot of effort, with him finally agreeing because it meant so much to Travis. And smiling, well, that was something that he had only seen his father do 3 times before. The first time was on the day when Travis graduated from college, then again a few days after that when he got hired at the post office. This was the main reason behind why he knew that even though he was having a hard time with the other supervisors, he was never going to quit working at the post office. The last time he saw his father smile was on their wedding day, when he first introduced him to Deborah. Other than those occasions, he could not recall ever seeing his father smile until tonight, as he escorted Deborah to the restaurant door, and now as they sat enjoying their meal. As their meal was coming to a close, the waiter brought the bill and placed it on the table, asking if everything was okay. Everyone responded that it was great and commended the chef and the staff. When the waiter left, Deborah started to reach for her purse while Travis and James continued talking and sipping wine. Paul looked at his son confused and then looked at James. "Wait a minute. What are y'all doing?" he angrily asked. Everyone immediately stopped what they were doing because of the tone in Paul's voice. He was definitely angry. Then he looked at Travis. "I raised you better than this, son. You don't let your wife pick up the check. What is wrong with you?" "Put your purse down, dear. You don't pay no bills, not while I'm here," Paul exclaimed. He scowled at Travis while leaning forward in his seat to take out his wallet. Deborah felt so honored that he was standing up for her, even against his own son. Then James blurted out, "Oh, she definitely got this one, Mr. Edwards." Paul glared at James and was about to tell him off. Travis jumped in and started to explain to his father what James meant when Deborah calmly asked, "You didn't tell him, Travis?" This got Paul's attention away from James, and he looked at her. "I never had a chance to," Travis answered. "Tell me what?" Paul snapped, irritated at being talked about like he wasn't sitting right there. Again, it was James who spoke up first, but this time the wine was having an effect on him, and he blurted it out. "That your daughter-in-law is a millionaire. She got big money." He was so caught up in the moment that he said it loud enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear, and they all turned and looked. "She's a what?" Paul asked, thoroughly confused. Then he turned and looked at Deborah. You're a what? A millionaire?" Paul said, stumbling through the question. Caught off guard, Deborah stammered, rushing to explain. "Yes, Paul, Carol and I, when we did the Robinson account, it was when I was in Jacksonville. Travis should have told you. I told him to tell you. Why didn't you tell him, Travis? Paul, I thought you already knew." "I never had the chance, Pop," Travis pleaded to his father. "I was telling you about the dinner, remember? I kept trying to tell you, and you said you didn't want to hear any more about Deborah, remember? You finally said you would come if I'd just shut up about it." Paul listened and finally sat back in his chair. Everyone at the table just sat quiet looking at him. Finally he stood up and raised his hand and shouted, Waiter, I need a vodka on the rocks over here immediately. Everyone at the table, and most of the people in the restaurant still watching the table, all started laughing again. Paul looked around at everyone laughing, confused at first. Then he joined in with the laughter and added, "Hell, you better make it a double." Chapter 46. Starting Over. In the weeks since Deborah returned, Paul's outlook on life had been rapidly changing. For the first time in years, he was truly able to feel happy for his son, and it surprised him. Up until that point, he had been unaware that he was feeling only spite for him instead. Paul had been hoping and looking forward to the day when Travis's relationship with Deborah fell apart again, finally teaching his son the lesson that he was unable to get Travis to see. It was the sole wish that he clung to, and why he got out of bed every morning. Until he'd actually met Deborah, he thought he had her all figured out. After the night of the dinner, now every day when he awoke, the first thought that crossed his mind was about his newfound family, Travis, Deborah, and Gary, and it made him feel happy. He was basking in the feeling that comes along with finding out that you were wrong about someone and that they were so much better than you thought. The kind of feeling that makes a person feel young again, reminding them that there is still so much that they have to learn in life, especially after, like in his case, thinking he'd become too old to learn anything new, having seen all there was left in life to see. On top of that, it wasn't something that he was able to share, knowing that neither Travis nor Deborah were old enough yet to really understand it, making him feel even better, because now he could see how his age was a benefit. He had been regularly sleeping until 10 in the morning, waking up feeling refreshed and full of energy. The first time it happened, he assumed it was because he had had such a good time the night before. Now, a week later, he just marveled at it all, laying in the same bed, staring at the same ceiling he'd looked at for the past 40 years, only now seeing it completely differently. He reflected on how he used to get up every day at the crack of dawn, especially after he'd retired, driven by the need to seize the day. Carpe diem! He used to say it every morning as soon as his feet touched the floor. He was unaware that it was intended to be a remedy against anxiety and fear, instead of a rallying call to action. But it didn't matter, because above all else, he set out to prove himself capable, determined to accomplish things and to put in a full day's work, so as not to be seen by anyone as lazy. Now, as he lay in bed, he chuckled to himself, thinking, "Who in the heck did I think was watching me?" As of late, his day started with a phone call to Travis, followed by a call to Deborah, and they always seemed happy to hear from him. After making his calls, he'd sit up, swing his feet off the bed and into his slippers, before making his way downstairs to the coffee pot. Then he'd come back upstairs and take a shower. It was his new routine, one that he had come to thoroughly enjoy in the past few days. Today, though, after getting dressed, for some unknown reason, he found himself still thinking about the ceiling in his bedroom while making his morning cup of coffee. That's the same ceiling that she was looking at. The one that was not good enough for her, he thought, remembering Teresa, who was technically still his wife, though he hadn't seen or heard from her in more than 20 years. Closer to 30, he thought, correcting himself. "But it's enough for me," he shouted to no one and everyone while standing there in his kitchen. Then he stopped and cocked his head to the side, realizing what he'd just said. "No, it's more than enough for me, isn't it?" he said aloud. He just stood there unmoving for a few moments, lost in thought. Then, after taking a sip of coffee, he came to a decision. He walked from the dining room into the living room and picked up the telephone. He dialed the number to his lawyer. After a brief conversation with him, he hung up, then called Travis, who answered on the first ring. "I'm selling this house, son," he said flatly. "Really, Pop? That's great. And truthfully, it's about time. I love the house, but really, Pop, I see you on the top floor of a high-rise condo, playing your jazz, having a drink at night, sitting on your balcony overlooking the city." "How long have you been seeing that, son?" Paul asked, surprised. "Ever since I was in college, Pop. I always thought about you back here, especially because I was away at college. I thought you were finally moving on with your life, doing the things that you always wanted to do. Then when I came home, I wanted to encourage you to do it. That's why I moved back in with you after college, Pop. I wanted us both to reach out and grab life together. But you weren't ready. I could see that. We've been waiting on Mom too long now. If she was coming back, she'd already been back by now. And if she shows up now, Pop, what could she say that would make it right? It's her loss, not yours, Pop, and you deserve so much better. You have always been the best man I know and the best dad I could ever have dreamed of having." Travis was happy to finally be able to get it off his chest. When he finished, the line stayed quiet. He began to think that he might have said too much. "Pop?" "I'm here, son. Just thinking about what a fool I've been all these years." "No, Pop!" Travis yelled into the phone. Paul's eyes went wide. His son had never once in his life raised his voice to him before. He was caught completely off guard and just held the phone to his ear, not knowing what to say, so he remained silent. "Pop, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell. But if you were any different, you would be less than the great man that you are today. You are a great dad, but you are an even greater husband. No other man in the world would have honored and respected his marriage like you have. It was you who taught me that when you marry someone, you marry them for life. No matter what happens, you stay together. You don't just talk the talk, Pop, you live it. I am too proud of you to listen to you say that, and I can't hear you call yourself a fool. I won't allow it, Pop." This time, when Travis stopped talking, he didn't have a cloud of doubt about what he'd said, though Paul remained silent just like before. When he did speak, he was choked up. "I used to want you and Deborah to fail, Travis, so that you learned your lesson." Paul struggled to hold back the tears from crying. Travis remained silent. He knew that his father needed to get through this without him saying that it was okay. After a few moments, Paul regained control of himself. "I am ashamed of that more than anything else, son," he finally confessed. "Only a strong man talks about the things that he's ashamed of, Pop. Hey, I got someone at the door. Let me call you back. I love you, old man." "I love you, son. And Deborah, too," he said, hanging up the phone. Paul remained where he stood for a moment, just looking at the receiver in his hand, as if in a daze. Then he shook his head, put the receiver back onto the cradle. He turned around and saw his half-finished cup of coffee on the dining room table. He put his hands on his hips and threw his head back. Breathing heavily, he was resisting the urge to cry again as his eyes came to focus on the ceiling in the living room. He now realized that he felt clean, renewed, and ready to start a new chapter in his life. Still looking up, he looked at the entire ceiling, from one end to the other. Confession really is good for the soul, he thought, laughing to himself. Then, looking around his house, he realized something that caught him completely off guard. "I really hate this house. I really, really do." Then he started laughing. As he continued laughing, now even harder than he understood why, the laughter suddenly turned into crying. For just a second he tried to stifle the crying, then felt the freedom of it and let himself cry. He heard a moan coming out of his mouth as if it belonged to someone else, and then he let it come out as loud as he could. The sound that started as a moan of anguish became a scream of freedom and lasted for 2 full minutes. He was finally able to release the decades of frustration that had built up inside of him. The frustration of not moving on with his life or meeting other people, the frustration that came from waiting for Teresa to return, and the frustration over not being qualified to become a supervisor. As he stood in his living room, for the first time that he could ever remember, he cried, and didn't care who heard him doing it. Chapter 47. Out with the Old. After hanging up with his father, Travis slowly put down his phone and sat back in his chair, amazed at how quickly his father was becoming whole again. He snickered to himself at the irony of it. He was the one who told Deborah how he wanted to be there for his father, and she turned out to be the one who really helped him the most. He thought of Deborah, then immediately grabbed his phone and called her. The call went to voicemail, but he had no intention of telling her what happened in a message, so he hung up. She was in the weekly meeting at Prentice and Van Meyer, unable to take the call. After waiting an hour, when he thought she might be free, he called again, and she answered on the first ring. "What is it? I knew you were going to call back. What's wrong? Is it Paul?" she asked. "Calm down, Miss Cleo. Dad is fine. No, he's better than fine. He called me earlier. That's when I tried to call you earlier. He told—" Deborah interrupted him. "He's calling me right now, Travis. Let me call you back. Wait a minute." But she'd already hung up. He waited for a second, then realized she was gone. I love that old man, he thought, still holding his phone. He wanted to tell Deborah that he never had the chance to tell his father about their moving to Jacksonville. The more he thought about it, though, it made him smile. Deborah breaking the news was better than if he did it, considering how much he respected her. When they talked about it the night after coming home from the dinner, he began hoping that his father would move with them so that he wouldn't stay in Philly alone. Feeling satisfied that she would handle it, he put the phone down and looked at the time. It was still an hour before lunch, and he suddenly became impatient. He didn't want to have to wait until his lunch break to find out how their call went. On a whim, he decided to go to Prentice and Van Meyer to meet with Deborah for lunch. They stopped off at James's office and invited him to join them, but he was too busy and was working through lunch. They drove to the nearby man-made lake in the center of the downtown area. They picked up hot dogs and drinks from the street vendor and had their lunch on the park bench. He was anxious to hear about her call, and she was anxious to tell him everything that they talked about. "He is selling the house, you know," she asked, then took a big bite from her chili dog. "I know, sweetheart, but come on, tell me what else he said," Travis said impatiently. He wasn't trying to stop her from eating, but he was impatient to hear what happened on the call, and now he had to wait for her to finish her mouthful of food. Deborah was still chewing and could only mumble a response, so he held her drink up to her mouth, putting the straw to her lips. She mumbled again and shook her head in agreement. Taking the straw in her mouth, she then took a big, long sip. Then she swallowed. "He wants to sell the house, and he's going to take a cruise." Now she paused and looked at Travis, whose face showed surprise. Now it was his turn to mumble a response to the news as he was chewing his mouthful of hot dog. He swallowed quickly. "He is what? Taking a cruise?" Travis asked. "Yes, can you believe it? And he's taking a long cruise too, Travis, A 3-month cruise, to be exact. When did he decide to do that? He only told me he wanted to sell the house. By now, she had taken another bite from her chili dog, so again, he had to wait for her to finish before she could answer his question. When she finished swallowing, she took another sip. He said he was tired of wasting his life waiting for a woman who was never coming back. Good for you! Some women don't know a good man when they have one, I says. He thanked me, and then get this, Travis. He said that he hated that house. He said that he hated it because it was full of bad memories that he had lived with for so long that he forgot they were still there. As she spoke, he sat still, no longer eating or drinking, just staring at her, hanging on her every word. She paused to swat a fly away from his hot dog. He started waving his hand back and forth over his food to keep the flies away, so that she could continue uninterrupted. When I asked him what he planned to do after he sold the house, because, I was hoping to talk him into coming with us to Jacksonville, right? She asked. Travis nodded impatiently. He said that he just wanted to get away from everything that he knew for a while, to see different places and different people. Then he came up with the idea to take a cruise. Just like that? Travis challenged. Yes, just like that. Well, yes, but I was the one who mentioned taking a 3-month cruise. I just suggested that he take the cruise while he waited for the house to sell. He thought it was a good idea. So I told him that you and I could take care of the paperwork if the house sold while he was on the cruise. She paused now, looking at him to see how he felt about what she'd said. Travis sat silent, still taking in what he was hearing, then after a few moments of silence, realized that she was waiting on him to speak. That was perfectly fine, Deb. You handled everything perfectly. But now you need to get to the part where you tell me that you're the one paying for this cruise, and how he took that, Travis said accusingly. She looked at him sheepishly. So I'm sitting here thinking that if we're taking care of the paperwork because he is on the cruise, then he left before the house sold, right? So he couldn't have sold the house to pay for the cruise. And that means the money for the cruise came from somewhere else. And that leaves all fingers pointing to you, Travis said convincingly. He tried to tell me no, Travis. He really tried. He was just going to take a weekend cruise, but I had to, Travis. I had to. But he deserves it, though, and you know it, too, she said. He let her finish, then reached over and kissed her. It wasn't a peck on the cheek kiss, nor was it the kind of kiss that one typically does in a public park. It was a, baby, I love you more than words can say, so I have to show you kiss. Because the kiss went on and on, the hot dog vendor told them to get a room before he moved to another location in the park. They kissed until they ran out of time for her to finish telling him about her call with Paul. With their lunch hour over, they went back to the office, and he had to pry himself away from her embrace before he could go back to work. It was 3 in the afternoon before work slowed down enough, and he had time to reflect on the lunch he shared with his wife and the things that she'd told him. He suddenly dropped his pen, picked up the phone, and quickly dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. "Hey, Mr. Loverman," she sang. Their kiss earlier was the only thing on her mind. "Hey, sweetheart," he replied. Unlike Deborah, his mind was on something else. "I don't remember. Did you ever tell Pop that we were thinking about moving to Jacksonville?" he asked. "No, we never got to that, but he was so happy, Travis. You should have heard him." Then she suddenly changed the subject. "If you kiss me again, I'll tell you more," she said. He knew better than to take her offer as a joke. "As soon as we get home, baby, okay?" "Okay, Mr. Loverman, as soon as we get home," she repeated. But he was still thinking about how they were going to break the news to his father that they wanted to move to Jacksonville, knowing full well that there was not going to be any time for talking about it when he got home, despite her promise to tell him more. At the same time, Paul was at home in the living room, still getting used to the idea that he was about to go on a cruise. It was the one thing that he'd wanted to do from the day he got married till now. He wanted at first to share the experience with his new wife, but found that she was reluctant, having a fear of water, so he didn't go. Then he wanted to share it with Travis to celebrate his graduation from high school. Travis, however, had plans to spend the week after graduation with classmates on a road trip to California. Then, as he neared retirement, he thought about taking his long-awaited cruise, but found that putting a new roof on the house took priority. He had to do it before he retired, because living on a fixed income wouldn't allow him to pay for it later. Now, he finally began planning for the event that he'd looked forward to on and off for the past 40 years. As he thought about the cruise, he reflected back on the morning when he lay in bed looking at the ceiling in his bedroom, with no idea how much this day held in store. "And it's only lunchtime!" he exclaimed, marveling at the realization, and now free of the things that were holding him back from enjoying his life, he was able to start seeing himself in a new relationship with a new woman. The saying, "You can never unsee what you've once seen," came into his mind while he was thinking about Deborah and the way she treated his son. He was so impressed with her, it made him want to find a woman who would treat him the same way. "Out with the old and in with the new," Paul said. Feeling like his life was renewed, he got up on his way out the door to find a real estate agent.